Angiosperms are flowering plants, and of course they have seeds within a fruit. So seed would be like the one on the right, like a peach, center of a peach as a seed, and then spores would be on the left. This is the bottom of a fern leaf, and on the bottom of a fern leaf you have these little structures called sori. Sori are basically groups of sporangia. Right, we talked about sporangia, spore-producing regions. So these are groups of sporangia, so basically it's like hundreds and hundreds of sporangia in that sorus, plural is sori. And then each of those sporangia is producing hundreds and hundreds of spores. So under a microscope, that's what a spore looks like. So very tiny. So let's talk a little bit about plant taxonomy, different groups of plants. And so if we looked at the phylogeny of plants, we see we have an ancestral green algae, and so this is related to the Charophyta. And then we have the origin of embryophytes here. So there's our common ancestor. And then we have several groups. So in these three groups here, we have liverworts, mosses, hornworts. These are our basal land plants, our most primitive land plants. All these three groups are considered bryophytes, or bryophyta. Excuse me. And these are called non-vascular plants because, like we said before, they have no vascular tissue. They do not have xylem, they do not have phloem. Okay, they use osmosis instead to move water throughout the body. Our second group, the next two, and so the next most primitive are the lycopodiophytes and the pteridophytes. The lycopodiophytes include club mosses, spike mosses, quillworts, and then the pteridophytes include the ferns, whisk ferns, horsetails. You're probably most familiar with ferns. These plants do have vascular tissue, but they don't have seeds. And so because of that, they're called seedless vascular plants. Okay? Or this should say pteridophytes, not pterophytes. So pteridophytes is what they're called. And then lastly, not lastly, second to last, we have the gymnosperms. So these are the sister to the next group we're talking about, the angiosperms. And the gymnosperms are the non-flowering seed plants. So they have seeds, but they don't have flowers. They have cones instead, right? And so these are non-flowering seed plants. And then the angiosperms are going to be our most derived plant group, our most advanced plant group. And these are called flowering seed plants. Okay, so these are our four main groups. And if we look at those four main groups and see who is most successful, it is clearly above and beyond today the most successful are angiosperms. These guys here. It wasn't always that way. Millions of years ago, you had other groups that were abundant and the most successful. But over the millions and millions of years, they've declined in abundance and declined in their success, and then angiosperms have taken off. And we'll talk about why that is later on when we get to angiosperms. But if we look at how many known species there are of each of these groups, notice in our bryophytes, we have about, what's that, like 25,000 different species. In our seedless vascular plants, basically our pteridophytes, we have about 13,000. In our gymnosperms, which are here, we have not even 1,000. But then our angiosperms at the bottom, 250,000 species, so 250,000 species within angiosperms. So if you put everybody else together and combine it, it's still not even close to how many angiosperm species we have. So today, far and away, angiosperms are by far the most successful group of plants. So the first group we'll talk about are the bryophytes. These are our non-vascular plants. They do not have vascular tissue. I cannot stress that enough. You need to know that. They do not have vascular tissue. They do not have xylem. They do not have phloem. Instead, they use osmosis to move water inside the body. So let's look at our phylogeny here. So like we showed, bryophytes are basal. So there's three plant lineages here. The Marchantiophyta, are the liverworts, basically squat little leaf-like creatures. The mosses, which you're probably familiar with, low to the ground, fluffy, soft, green. And your hornworts, which Anthocerophyta, which look like a little stalk coming up. But all three of these are small, they're close to the ground, and they have to live near water. So let's talk about their characteristics. So number one, all bryophytes have a gametophyte-dominated life cycle. In other words, the gametophyte, the haploid version of this plant, is the dominant version. The one that you most associate with bryophytes is haploid, gametophytic. Like the green moss, that's the gametophyte version. All lack vascular tissue. So that's why they're called non-vascular plants. Okay? They do not have xylem, they do not have phloem, they use osmosis to move water into their bodies, which is why they need to be found near water. They have no vascular tissue, and their sperm is flagellated, so it has a flagella on their sperm. So if the sperm has a flagella, that flagella doesn't work unless it's in water. And so they need to be near water, which is why you find mosses and things in moist places, right? Near ponds, streams, where there's water dripping, oftentimes there's moss. This is why. Third, they do not have seeds, right? They're seedless plants. So they use spores instead of seeds to disperse. Fifth, they do not have true leaves. True leaves have vascular tissue. These guys don't have vascular tissue. So what do they have instead? They have something called phyllodia, and that's their word there. So phyllodia are false leaves. They look like leaves. They're flat, and they have a surface area to catch sunlight for photosynthesis, but there's no vascular tissue within it. There's no xylem or phloem, and so we can't really consider it a leaf, and so it's called a false leaf. It's a phyllodia. And then 6, they don't have any roots for the same reason. Roots, technically, are structures that have vascular tissue, xylem and phloem. Since they don't have that, we call them false roots, rhizoids. Rhizoids, they have basically anchoring structures, which help with taking up water through osmosis, but since they don't have vascular tissue, we can't technically call them roots. Okay? And lastly, most are homosporous. Okay? And homosporous is basically where the spore grows into a gametophyte that's both male and female at the same time. Okay? So there's basically only one type of spore. I know that doesn't mean much to you, but later on we'll talk about plants producing 2 types of spores, boy spores and girl spores. Okay? In bryophytes you just have one, and that's called homosporous. When you just have one type of spore, homosporous. Later on we'll talk about some higher plants producing girl spores, boy spores. One grows up into a boy, one grows up into a girl. That's called heterosporous. Bryophytes, homosporous. So let's talk about the gametophyte portion of mosses and hornworts, liverworts, bryophytes first. So what you think of a moss is the gametophyte version. It's the fuzzy green portion. Most of the life cycle, like we said, is gametophytic. It's gametophyte dominated. This is the only portion of the bryophytes that goes through photosynthesis. We'll talk about the sporophyte in a bit, and the sporophyte does not go through photosynthesis. Okay, so just the gametophyte is green. That's the one that actually creates food. As you know, gametophyte means producing gametes. So this is the structure that's going to be producing our sperm and our egg. And so in mosses we have a boy moss and a girl moss, but sometimes you don't. Sometimes you just have one and it's producing has boy and girl parts. But again, the same terms apply. The boy part, whether it's alone on its own structure or together with another structure is called the antheridium. The girl part is the archegonium. Again, it doesn't matter where it is. If it produces eggs, it's an archegonium. If it produces sperm, it's an antheridium. Okay? And as we said, it needs water for transferring the sperm to the egg. Usually what happens is that the gametophyte grows up like this, and then in order for the sperm to get to the egg, so in other words, for the sperm to get from the antheridium to the egg, which is inside of the archegonium, the egg does not move, stays inside that archegonium and waits. The sperm has to get there via water. So usually what happens is rain will come down, will splash the top of the antheridium busts open, some of that sperm from that antheridia will splash onto archegonia. And then when that happens, the sperm travels down to the egg, fertilization, you produce a sporophyte. This is what you produce. So once that sperm splashes onto that archegonia, travels to the egg, from that archegonium, on that gametophyte, a sporophyte grows out of it. Okay, so the sporophyte is connected to the fuzzy green gametophyte. So like you see here, fuzzy green gametophyte, and these brown structures, these stalks that are growing up out of the fuzzy green gametophyte, that is the sporophyte. That is the diploid portion that was created from sperm and egg combining. Okay, so as we said, it grows out of the female gametophyte, specifically the archegonium, because that's where the egg is, the gametangium. Okay. The sporophyte is completely dependent upon the gametophyte for survival. It cannot go through photosynthesis, and so it gets all of its energy from the gametophyte. This is why we say in bryophytes they are gametophyte dominant, because sporophyte is completely dependent upon the gametophyte. And inside of your sporophyte, you have a sporangia. The sporangia is up at the top here, that little capsule portion there, that's the sporangia. Inside of the sporangia, you have spores, right? Sporangia is just the spore-producing region of the sporophyte. You produce spores from there. Okay, so the spores fly away when during dry weather. Basically, that capsule up top, the sporangia, cracks open, and then those spores get released. They fly away, they land, produces a new gametophyte. Okay, and that's the life cycle. Okay, so that's the whole life cycle. So this is a very important diagram for you to know. You should be able to label all the things on this diagram, know what's happening. Okay, so let's start here. So you have your let's start here, gametophyte, and then your gametophyte, here you have your sporangium at the top. Your sporangium is going to be producing your spores. The spores, remember this is via meiosis, like we said. Spores are produced by the sporangium via meiosis, because your sporophyte is diploid, your spores are haploid. Okay, it produces the spores fly away, and they produce a female gametophyte, male gametophyte. So this is showing it being heterosporous, right? You have a boy moss and a girl moss, and that does occur in some bryophytes, but that's the exception. Most bryophytes are homospores, so you have archegonia and antheridia on the same structure. So don't let that confuse you. Regardless, you have the archegonia where the egg is, antheridia where the sperm are. Rain comes down, splashes the antheridia, the sperm goes to the egg, the archegonia, basically the egg which is inside the archegonia. Fertilization happens, and then the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte. So basically you have the zygote forming, which is the young sporophyte. Sporophyte develops and produces sporangium. That's your life cycle. So know that diagram.
Mosses alternate between the haploid gametophyte and the diploid sporophyte during their life cycle. The sporophyte generation in bryophytes develops from the gametophyte. Sporophytes receive much of their nutrition from the gametophyte. Spores are produced by meiosis in the capsule of the sporophyte. The spore capsule ripens, bursts, and releases the spores. A spore germinates to form a protonema.
You don't need to know that term.
The antheridium develops on the male gametophyte. Sperm form within the antheridium. The archegonium develops on the female gametophyte. An egg forms within the archegonium. Sperm are released from the antheridium and swim to the archegonium.
By rain droplets.
Fertilization takes place inside the archegonium and a zygote is formed. The zygote divides by mitosis to form a new sporophyte in the form of a stalk and capsule.
Pretty good explanation, very succinct. Alright, so some few pictures. This is your moss. Notice you have your sporophytes growing out of your gametophyte. And so this group is the Bryophyta, which is the same name as the larger group Bryophyta. So you have a Bryophyta within the Bryophyta. It's a little confusing, but these are the mosses. Again, you have the gametophyte of the bryophyte, and then you have the sporophyte growing out of the gametophyte. This is Bryophyta. Liverworts, Marchantiophyta. Again, they don't really look like mosses, right? Moss is kind of furry. Liverworts, they look flat, but they're a type of bryophytes. And then hornworts look like little stalks. I've actually never seen hornworts before. I've seen these guys, but never seen hornworts. But yeah, all these are bryophytes. They all follow the same general life cycle. So you can use that life cycle diagram to characterize all three. So looking back on plant taxonomy again, we covered the non-vascular plants or bryophytes. Our next group are our pteridophytes. I should say pteridophytes, not pterophytes. Pteridophytes are lycopodiophytes and pteridophytes. We'll cover the gymnosperms and angiosperms next week. So before we get into the pteridophytes, know that over evolutionary history, we need to talk about some of the new developments that occurred in the plants that evolved from a bryophyte-like ancestor. Because bryophytes are the most primitive of plants. Right now we're getting into some of the more advanced ones. One of the trends that occurs is, if you look on the left here, we have our charophytes, our green algae. They were basically haplontic, remember? Like we said, they have a haplontic life cycle. So most of their life is gametophyte. And then their sporophyte is only as a zygote and it's unicellular. That's a definition of haplontic, having a unicellular diploid stage and a multicellular haploid stage. For bryophytes, we said they're gametophyte dominated. And it's true. Most of their life cycle is spent as the haploid stage, and then only a small portion is that sporophyte that grows up out of it. But it is multicellular, so it's a little bit more complex than the green algae. Over evolutionary time, plants, as they got more and more derived and more evolved, reduced the role of the gametophyte. As you see, the gametophyte's importance is going lower and lower and lower, and they increased the role of the sporophyte, the diploid portion. The sporophyte is getting larger and larger. Right? What you think of an oak tree, or a pine tree, or a fern in the forest, all those are sporophytes. The gametophyte is tiny, tiny in all three of them. Sometimes it's inside of the flower as a few cells. Right? So it's very small in angiosperms, it's small in gymnosperms, it's a little bit larger in ferns. But over evolutionary time, the trend is that the gametophyte is reducing in complexity and size, and the sporophyte is increasing in complexity and size. So you should know about that trend. So what else do we have now that we're getting into the pteridophytes and the higher plants? Well, we also have true roots and true leaves. So a root is basically an organ that is going to anchor vascular plants to a surface, And these also are going to absorb water and absorb nutrients. So surface area to absorb some things from the soil. Roots evolved from stems, specifically subterranean stems. So roots evolved from stems that were sort of underground, and they turned into roots. Now, we also have leaves, and so true leaves are going to be organs that are going to increase the surface area, the photosynthetic surface of vascular plants, and they have to have vascular tissue to be considered leaves, right? Same thing with roots. You have to have vascular tissue to be considered a root. So there's two kinds. There's two kinds of leaves, I should say. There's microphylls and there's megaphylls. Microphylls are leaves with a single vein in them. You don't see them in any plants that you're probably familiar with. They do not have microphylls. These are in very, very primitive plants, and most plants today have evolved away from microphylls because it basically just looks like a thin stalk, and they've turned them into megaphylls. Megaphylls are leaves with a highly branched vascular system. Think of a maple leaf, or an oak leaf, or sycamore leaf, or any leaf that you can think of is probably a megaphyll. A good example of a microphyll would be like a pine needle, right? Just a thin stalk there. So megaphylls actually evolved from microphylls. So microphylls evolved first as outgrowths of the stem, and then eventually to increase surface area, and eventually those microphylls had microphylls on them, and eventually that vascular system branched, and then you had webbing between those branches, and then eventually you'd have a leaf. So let's look how that happened. So initially you have a stem, and then you have outgrowths of that stem. The outgrowth becomes is considered a microphyll, and then what happens is those microphylls eventually have webbing between them. You get microphylls growing off of microphylls, and then the webbing would increase surface area as well, right? A mutation occurs where one plant has webbing, and then that increases surface area exponentially, so it survives more, it reproduces more, etc. And by natural selection, plants that have more webbing increase in abundance, those that have less decrease in abundance. So that's how you get megaphylls evolving. So let's talk about our next group, our pteridophytes. Our pteridophytes are basically ferns and fern allies, or fern-like plants. So some pteridophyte characteristics. Number one, unlike mosses and bryophytes, they do not have a gametophyte-dominant life cycle. They have a sporophyte-dominated life cycle. They do have vascular tissue, so we do have xylem and phloem. These are seedless vascular plants. But they do not have seeds. So they still use spores to disperse the embryos. They don't use seeds. They possess horizontally growing underground rhizomes. And so, these are basically structures that allow for a fern to pop up a new fern close by without actually spreading of spore and the spore landing and growing up. So basically you can have a fern, and then underground it has a rhizome, and it's basically a horizontal stem, horizontal root-ish structure, and it'll go underground and then pop up a new fern here. Okay, that's called a rhizome. They also possess sporophylls. So do the bryophytes. So do all plants. I don't know why I have that there. All plants have sporophytes and sporangia. Oh, the sporophylls. My mistake. Sporophylls. So sporo obviously means spore. Phyll means leaf, and so this is a spore-bearing leaf. And so it's a leaf that has sporangia on it, and then the sporangia are producing spores. Most are homosporous, and so just like we said with the bryophytes, most of them, so homosporous, like we said, the spore is going, there's not a male and a female spore, there's one type of spore, and that spore lands, produces a structure a gametophyte, that gametophyte has both boy and girl parts on it. It's hermaphroditic. It has both an archegonia on it, and it has antheridia on it. Okay, so the gametophyte is that structure. It has gametangia. The gametangia are archegonia and antheridia. All right. So, what groups do we have in the pteridophytes? Well, two large groups, two lineages of seedless vascular plants. We have the lycopodiophytes. The lycopodiophytes include the club mosses and the spike mosses. And we have the pteridophytes. The pteridophytes include ferns, whisk ferns, and horsetails. Hundreds of millions of years ago, these groups were the dominant plants on Earth. We had forests full of pteridophytes. We have lycopodiophytes that were 40 meters tall, gigantic forests of lycopodiophytes. So this was way before angiosperms had evolved, way before gymnosperms had evolved. These dominated the Earth. So if we look at sort of a timeline of who was dominant, notice today, this is today, and this is, you're going back in time as you go down. Notice seed plants today are just, kicking everybody's butt in the way of who's dominant. They're completely dominating everything. But they used to be not that dominant, right? But notice our lycopid, it says lycopsids here, those are the lycopodiophytes. And then manilophytes, which is the same as the pteridiophytes. These guys used to be dominant back in the Carboniferous, right? The Carboniferous is a time when these guys had free reign of the land. Angiosperms and seed plants were nothing, and these guys dominated. So you had basically forests that look like this, where all these guys here are ferns, right? They don't look like the ferns that we think of today, but these are like 50-meter, 60-meter trees that are ferns or lycopodiophytes, like club mosses. And so they were gigantic. And something like this, where these are lycopodiophytes and fern trees that were just huge. And then eventually angiosperms outcompeted these guys and seed plants, so not just angiosperms, gymnosperms and angiosperms, they're both seed plants. They outcompeted these guys and eventually took over. But Carboniferous, it used to look like this. Today, if you want to see a field of lycopodiophytes, or it would look like this. So this is me at Hoosier National Forest, and all these things on the ground here are lycopodiophytes. They're not very common. When you find them, it's almost like a rarity. But they are around, but this is how big lycopodiophytes get now. Pretty tiny, mostly. And so they've really been reduced in size. And so let's talk a little bit about some lycopodiophytes first, and then we'll get to the pteridiophytes next. So the lycopodiophytes, like we said, they're the club moss and spike moss. So what that field that I was standing in there in that last picture, those were club moss. And so club moss have a special structure called a strobilus. And a strobilus is basically, we talked about what a sporophyll was, right? A spore-producing leaf. A strobilus is a group of sporophylls all clustered together. Okay, so it looks almost like it looks kind of like a cone, but it's not a cone, but it kind of looks like it at the top of a plant. I'll show you a picture in a second. But that's called a strobilus. It's a bunch of spore-producing leaves all clumped together. And then spike moss are often called resurrection plants because these are the most drought-tolerant plants in the world, the most drought-tolerant vascular plants in the world. They're called resurrection plants because they can dry out during a drought and just look like brown, dead plant, and then a rain will come and they'll just come back to life and grow green again, and then photosynthesize and take up water. And so that's why they're called resurrection plants, because it seems like they've resurrected. So, I guess I don't have a picture of a Lycopodiophyte strobilus. Hopefully I'll show you one in lab. So our next group, our pteridophytes, are mostly ferns and